So, friends, we've had about 24 hours now to let sink in the reality that a special counsel will now be heading up the criminal investigation of Donald Trump. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I want to talk about why this may actually prove to be a good development. Let's talk about that because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So, as I'm sure you know by now, Attorney General Merrick Garland has appointed a special counsel to take over the ongoing criminal investigations of Donald Trump, a gentleman named Jack Smith. Let's talk about why this special counsel appointment might actually prove to be a good thing for the prospect of justice. Now, thus far, Attorney General Merrick Garland has been in charge of, been supervising, overseeing all of the criminal investigations being conducted by the Department of Justice of the crimes of Trump and company. And those investigations, which have been going on for nearly 2 years now, have produced exactly 0 indictments of the ruling class criminals, right? Donald Trump, Mark Meadows, Jeffrey Clark, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and I could go on and on. 0 indictments, not 1 minute of accountability for any of the high government officials that participated in the attempted overthrow of our government. I think it can fairly be observed that Merrick Garland is a thoughtful, careful, circumspect, cautious person who is prone to engage in what seems to be endless analysis. Some might even call it analysis paralysis. Now remember, Merrick Garland was a prosecutor more than a quarter of a century ago, including at my former office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. And he was reputed to be an outstanding prosecutor. But for the nearly quarter of a century before President Biden nominated him to be Attorney General, he was a judge. And goodness knows, that quarter of a century made him very judicial, prone to lots and lots of analysis, which is precisely what we want our judges to be, right? They're going to need to deeply and at great length analyze every angle of every issue before they can write an opinion. But how does all of that analysis manifest itself in law enforcement investigations? Well, we know that it took more than a year to just secure a search warrant for Mar-a-Lago. The federal government knew, the law enforcement authorities knew that Donald Trump stole and was unlawfully concealing some of our nation's most coveted secrets, national defense information, classified documents, and secrets about the nuclear programs of foreign countries. He was unlawfully concealing it at his Florida home at Mar-a-Lago. And it took a year or more just to complete all the analysis and get to the point where we could just obtain a search warrant, for goodness sakes, to wrestle back from Donald Trump the evidence of crime he stole, the evidence that was endangering our national security that we knew he had. That is too much analysis and not enough law enforcement, in my opinion and experience. But that's what we had under the investigative leadership of Merrick Garland. So I think the last couple of years have showed us, and I think it can be fairly observed, that Merrick Garland has proven to be too much judge and not enough prosecutor. But now there is a career prosecutor heading up the ongoing criminal investigations of Donald Trump, Jack Smith. And if you'll bear with me for a minute, I want to take just a little bit of time reading a short summary of just some of what Jack Smith has done as a prosecutor, and then we'll use that as a leaping off point for why this may turn out to be a very good development for justice. Here is some of the recent reporting by Politico. Headline, New Trump Special Counsel Launches Investigation in Mueller's Shadow. Bob Mueller, the former special counsel who investigated all things Trump-Russia. Put a pin in that Mueller reference. We're going to come back to it. The article reads in part, the record of Justice's public integrity section while Jack Smith was in charge is one of great success at prosecuting corruption among state and local officials, but decidedly mixed results in the highest profile cases against federal officials. Under Smith's leadership, that is the public integrity section at the Department of Justice, under Smith's leadership in the early 2010s, the roughly 30-person prosecution team known as PIN won jury convictions of former Representative Rick Renzi, a Republican from Arizona, on racketeering, bribery, and extortion charges, and secured guilty verdicts against a former Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, officer, Jeffrey Sterling, for sharing classified information with a New York Times reporter, James Risen. However, Smith's anti-corruption team fell flat in its efforts to prosecute former Senator John Edwards, Democrat from North Carolina, for his alleged role in more than $1 million in money that flowed from his supporters to a woman who had an affair with Edwards while he was a candidate for the 2008 Democratic presidential nomination. In May 2012, after a 5-week trial and 9 days of deliberations, a jury in North Carolina returned one not guilty verdict against Edwards and deadlocked on 5 others. The Justice Department quickly announced that Edwards would not be retried. And while Smith's team notched a victory in the 2014 extortion and bribery trial of former Governor Bob McDonnell, Republican from Virginia, his convictions were overturned 2 years later by the Supreme Court, which reined in some efforts to pursue public corruption. Of course, because why would the Supreme Court let us, the Department of Justice, pursue public corruption charges against high government officials? No, the Supreme Court cut back on that. That's not a failure of Jack Smith or his lawyers. That's a failure of the Supreme Court. But I digress. Smith also helped shepherd an investigation several years ago into alleged corruption on the part of Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, New Jersey. Although the indictment of Menendez came down about 2 months after Smith left the Department of Justice Public Corruption Unit for a federal prosecutor job in Nashville, Tennessee. That case went to trial in Newark 2 years later, resulting in a hung jury. Prosecutors also opted not to retry that case. So some of what qualifies Jack Smith to be special counsel to criminally investigate and ultimately prosecute Donald Trump? Well, he was a war crimes prosecutor at the Hague, trying to make right some of the world's most egregious wrongs. Talk about translatable experience, because he will now have the task of holding accountable Donald Trump, one of the world's most egregious wrongs. And then if we go back to the Politico article, you see that under his leadership, the public integrity section at the Department of Justice prosecuted Representative Rick Renzi, a Republican from Arizona, Senator John Edwards, a Democrat from North Carolina, Governor Bob McDonnell, a Republican from Virginia, Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey. You see the pattern emerging? Jack Smith is somebody who has walked the walk. He's made it clear. He will bring difficult, challenging, politically charged cases against Republicans and against Democrats. That's what I call without fear or favor, without timidity, without a concern for losing or being embarrassed, because he won some of those cases, his prosecutors, and they lost some of those cases. And you know what, friends? Give me a prosecutor who is willing to bring difficult, challenging, politically charged cases without regard for party, right? Republicans and Democrats alike. Give me a prosecutor who's willing to bring a case that's not a sure thing, because it's more important to try cases than to win cases, especially public corruption cases. Give me a prosecutor who walks the walk, brings those cases, and then maybe loses a case every now and then, or maybe suffers a hung jury, right? Because the jurors cannot unanimously agree on guilt. Give me that prosecutor, because that's the prosecutor I want on my team all day, every day. And that seems to be who Jack Smith is. Let's go back to the comparison to the Mueller special counsel appointment, because I was concerned when I saw a special counsel is being appointed now, late in the game. What does that mean as far as the timeline for accountability? The Mueller appointment was Bob Mueller being appointed as special counsel where no investigation had been conducted, right? This was the initiation of an investigation into all things Trump-Russia. So Bob Mueller had to go about interviewing and hiring investigators, interviewing and hiring prosecutors and a support staff, and finding office space and standing up an office, and then commence an investigation. And it took about 22 months from start to finish. Well, 22 months from right now puts us on the eve of a presidential election. We don't have that kind of time. But that is not the task to which Jack Smith has been assigned. Jack Smith has basically replaced Merrick Garland as the person who will now oversee, supervise, control the criminal investigations that have been ongoing into Donald Trump. So on the timing front, there shouldn't be a moment lost. In fact, I maintain that the pace that had been set by Merrick Garland was so woefully slow and inadequate that the pace can only quicken moving forward now that a guy like Jack Smith is in charge. So yes, I will say the announcement yesterday of a special counsel felt like a big dark cloud, but I think we have good reason to focus on the silver lining that is hiding behind that big dark cloud, because accountability has not come for any of the ruling class criminals while Merrick Garland was heading up the investigative efforts. But now it feels like there is at least a chance. There is at least the prospect, the realistic prospect of things beginning to accelerate. And friends, if ever things needed to accelerate, it is on the accountability front for the crimes of Donald Trump and all of his co-conspirators, all of his criminal associates. Because justice matters. Hang in there, friends. We need to take this one day at a time, and we will, together. As always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.